Welcome to part 1 of sewing this glamour robe. As mentioned in my previous video, we will be using the Simplicity pattern. We will be focusing on the bodice front, back, and the sleeves. The original back pattern piece has a seam which we don't need, so please fold in about 1/2 inch and place on the fold. You will be using the left side bodice front piece for both sides of your garment, so please place that on the fold and cut to, being mindful of grain line. The sleeve pattern piece is wide, so adjust for that on your fabric. Cut one of the skirt front on the fold. This will now be your garment's back. Similar to the sleeves, the side skirt is quite wide. Here I've folded my fabric twice and adjusted my pattern by folding it over, as it very closely mirrors itself, and I'm cutting 2 on the fold. You may need to unfold your fabric here and play around a bit to make sure that you have a wide enough piece. I'm now cutting out the skirt back piece, but adding a seam allowance. This will now be my skirt front, and the extra seam allowance will allow for a hem. For neck facings, take a piece of fabric and fold it in half. This is where we're cutting the back, and simply cut out a similar shape as you've done already with your back piece. Again, being mindful of the fold. You're not going to want to cut a full piece. Instead, you stop short a few inches down to the armhole and then make a curve up from that back fold. This makes more sense here in just a few seconds when you can see as I lay it out how that facing piece will be. Repeat the same process for the inside, always being mindful of your grain line. A quick note, I have added audio and text to this so that you can watch using the preferred method that helps you the most. Please feel free to mute me or ignore the text in order to pay attention to one over the other. I realize it's a little crazy if you try to pay attention to all of it. If you're making a bishop sleeve, you're going to want to cut 2 of the sleeve bands on the bias. To get started on sewing this, we will begin with the back bodice piece and we will put in our waist darts. Be mindful to mark the dart apex utilizing the markings on your pattern piece, and you can mark them with a pin or a chalk mark. And you'll start from the bottom where the notches are and stitch all the way up to that apex, trying to stitch as straight as possible. For the front darts, there is a side and a waist. Again, mark the apex of where your dart needs to end and start at the side where the notches are and stitch to that marking point. Since these front pieces are cut on the bias, this side dart is a little tricky. If you're newer to this, I recommend laying the piece out and baste stitching. A baste stitch is a very loose hand-sewn stitch that you pull out afterwards, but this will hold the dart in place and you can stitch over it or next to it. Repeating the same process we did with the back waist seam, we will be doing that to the front waist seam. Again, stitching from the notch marks at the edge all the way to your marking where the apex of the dart is. If darts are a bit vexing for you, I recommend getting some of the scrap fabric from your project and doing some practice runs. Sometimes silks and satins can be really slippery. Now let's attach the bodice front and the bodice back. Lay both sides together with the fabric facing in and attach at the shoulder seams. From here, we will be adding our sleeve. Open up your bodice so that the sleeve hole is apparent and match the sleeve back with the bodice back as noted by the notches. Usually a double notch indicates the back. You'll start from one side and simply stitch all the way around. You want to be mindful, there will be a notch at the top of your sleeve. This will indicate that it needs to match the seam of your shoulder on the bodice. You might have to finesse some of the fabric in there, pushing part of the sleeve in so that it has a little bit of a gather. Yes, this is slightly tricky. Again, feel free to pin this or baste stitch it however you need to do it. Sometimes working with really lightweight silks is a bit tricky, but I have every faith that you can do this. It might just take a little bit of practice, but you'll get there. As the text mentions, once you're done here, either zigzag or use a serger to finish off the seam so that it doesn't fray. If you are lining your robe, you don't need to do this because there will be a lining. If you are planning to add a bishop sleeve, I suggest going to the end of this video and watching how to add your gathered cuff now before going to this next step. Parlez-vous français? Let's do some French seams. This is great if you are not lining your garment and you don't have a serger. Sew your garment with the fabric side out, 1/4 of an inch, all the way from the bottom of the sleeve through the armpit and down the bodice. Next, you will trim that seam so it's as clean as possible and pretty close to the stitching, not so close that it'll fray out easy, but close enough. From here, you'll flip the garment inside out and you'll fold that seam inwards and then stitch around it, essentially encasing that seam. And this can be an easier process if you press that seam a bit. And it does take a little bit of work, especially in a lightweight silk, but it looks really nice and it'll ensure that your seams won't fray. This is a really cool technique if you don't have a serger, and I will probably film another tutorial showing how to do it a little bit more in depth. To place your facings, you'll want to repeat the same steps you did with the bodice by sewing the shoulder seams together. This is a great opportunity for me to thank all of my patrons and welcome all the new ones. Welcome aboard the crafting ship. Now you'll need to finish off the inside of your inner facing, so use a sweet hem foot like this. Consult your machine's manual to find out which one you need to buy, or you can zigzag or serge. To attach the facing and the garment, simply lay them together, facing each other, fabric facing in, and use stitch all the way around, being mindful to match your shoulder seams. From there, you'll want to make a few notches in the neck seam in order to release some of the tension, flip it out and fold it and press, and it should look like this. Let's talk about these bishop sleeves. I would have loved to have demonstrated this while the sleeve was open, but I wanted to show you what a bell sleeve looked like. What I'm using is my gather foot, and I'm going around all the edge of the sleeve and gathering it as tight as possible. If you don't have a gather or a ruffle foot, you can do this manually, or you can run a base stitch along and pull the base stitch until it's the same circumference as your cuff. I've already sewn my cuff into a loop, so now I will pull the gathered part through and finesse the gathery bits into the circumference of the cuff to where I can get it to a place where I can start sewing. Again, wouldn't this be nice to do if it was all flat? I like to torture myself. Keep working at it here bit by bit, pushing more gathers into that seam to make sure that it's all fitting inside the cuff circumference. Patience, patience. The next step is to place you're basically doing a double hem, and the second part of that goes over the gathered seam and encases it in. So you fold it once and then you fold it again and it goes over the gathers and then you stitch it down. Now you can press at this step and put a based stitch in and that will help you, or you can really just make things super hard for yourself and do it as you go. And again, it's little by little, folding and sewing, folding and sewing. The trick here is to try and make it as pretty as possible on both sides by staying really close to that seam. But ultimately, you get something that's pretty nice. And you get to give yourself a gold star for getting it done.